Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is the author of Awake, It's Your Turn, a book that serves as a comprehensive yet simple guide in facilitating awakening. He experienced awakening at the age of 24, but didn't start teaching until many years later when he noticed that while having regular conversations with people, they would start experiencing profound shifts in their experience to reality. He currently works full-time as an anesthesiologist, and in his free time, he works with people undergoing the awakening process. Angelo DiLullo, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So before we dive right in, I want to just kind of put a little context, kind of how you came into my world. So I don't know, there's a lot of spiritual teachers out there, meditation teachers, but there seems to be something about doctors teaching awakening that seems to have the greatest resonance with me. First, it was Daniel Ingram, who is an ex-ER physician and author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, which is one of the books that has impacted me the most over the last couple of years. I actually had him on the first episode of this podcast, and then several listeners commented on that episode that I should interview you. So I started to research you, and it turns out you're also a doctor by profession. I watched a couple of interviews, started reading your book, doing the meditations on your app, and I was hooked. And similar to Daniel, I found your approach very pragmatic, but more simple and less technical. It does seem that Buddhism also had a strong impact on you, but the way you teach awakening, it just feels very clean, very natural, almost free of any tradition. So that's just kind of like context to like how you came. And yeah, I don't know what it is that, I don't know if it's like having the background with being a doctor, it just makes it more pragmatic. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, as when you mentioned the sort of non-referencing of any specific tradition, I thought to say that that I think that's it for me. That's important that I can express this that we're talking about without referencing really any kind of dogma or specific map or way of approaching it in a philosophical way or a historical way, but not because I am anti-tradition. I'm not at all. And there's a tremendous amount to be learned from Buddhism and other traditions. But there's something about the realization itself that's just alive in the moment. And that's, for me, or my instinct tells me, that's really the only place I would trust myself to teach from or to point from. So I think it took many years before this integrated enough or settled enough to where I would trust that I could just speak in the moment, from the moment, and as the moment, and let this unfold however it does for whomever it does. And it seems to know when to come up. I don't have any agenda whatsoever to talk about it or to wake anybody up or wake everybody up. And yet it's amazing when conditions align what is possible and the degree to which people wake up. Yeah, I do reference certain traditions. I reference Buddhism here and there, but I am no expert on Buddhism at all. Daniel Ingram has a far deeper and more nuanced knowledge of Buddhism than I do. But I did spend some time as a Zen Buddhist, and I did sesshins and the kind of meditation retreats and so forth, and worked through koans and all that. But for me, it's interesting. That was kind of after the fact, after the awakening and the realization. It hadn't fully integrated, but the insights were there. So it was interesting to go back and sort of do it as almost like playing the role of someone in the relative world going through that, and yet there was no identity left there anymore. It's a very strange thing and hard to talk about, but I did learn a lot, mostly about how to convey it, perhaps how to work with other people and practical means as they move through these experiential insights.
Yeah, the way you describe it, like that's exactly how I experience your teachings in your book. It's just like so clean. On my website, I have books I recommend, and I put them in categories. And I'm just thinking, I'm like, where do I put his book? Do I put it in meditation? Do I put it in spirituality? Or do I make a whole separate category called awakening? Because it just felt that clean, like it didn't fit into anything. It was like, this is just awakening and nothing else. So I guess let's just dive right into awakening.
Sure.
And awakening isn't something that you can put into words, yet teachers will still use words to point to what it is. And although you may explain awakening differently to people at a different point of the path, how do you explain awakening in the simplest way to the broadest audience of those who are very new to spirituality or meditation? What is awakening?
I love it. That's a great question. How do you say it to the broadest audience? That question is important to me, because I find that often as people wake up in whatever tradition, or even if it's not in a tradition, in whatever way they're perceiving it happening, whatever life context it's happening in, they tend to sort of, not everyone, but it's just human nature. We tend to sort of purvey or convey or describe the process from that context. But the thing about realization is it really is in no context. Everything else in the world is in some sort of context. Everything in our life is in some sort of context. But the beauty of realization itself, or let's just say unfiltered reality as it is right now, is it's not bound to any context. It is absolutely free of all stories, narratives, context, traditions. And so with that said, going back to having not talked about this for 15 years after these shifts for me publicly, or really to anyone, because I didn't want to do it until I could trust myself to speak to a wide enough audience, because I knew it wasn't just about Buddhists, right? Of course, it wasn't just about meditators. It wasn't just about Hindu, whatever. It was about anyone who perceives themselves as suffering and can intuit anywhere inside themselves that there must be a different way to live. And that can be an atheist. It can be a man, a woman, a 18-year-old, a 79-year-old. It can be a Christian, a Buddhist, someone who, it doesn't matter what tradition or what belief system you have at all. That's the fascinating thing about it. So it is in my heart important to speak about this in a way that the most unlikely person will hear it, and go, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I've been looking for. And I hear people tell me that pretty frequently. I did a series, probably the most widely accessible series of interviews I did were with Zubin, with Z-Dog MD. Yeah. I had so many people tell me, I never believed in spirituality. I thought it was woo-woo. I'm too scientific. I didn't get it. But somehow the way you said it, it clicked. And I went, oh my God, that's what he's addressing, what I've always sort of wanted to address, but I never really knew it was even possible. That's music to my ears. That's my goal, if there is a goal. So how to go about that? That's the question. Again, sometimes sort of stripping it of too much doctrine helps. And there's a reason for that. It's very psychological. Our minds are wired to, without even knowing it. Sometimes we obviously know it a lot of times, but often we don't even realize we tend to compartmentalize ourselves. We put ourselves in, oh, I'm a Buddhist or I'm not a Buddhist. I'm this or I'm not that. And we tend to think in those terms. So when we hear messages or hear a podcast, watch a video, start reading a book, even look at the title of a book, we have a tendency to filter right away and go, this is for me or it's not for me. But I know it's for anyone who's suffering. So I had to really work with how I wrote that book to make sure I don't filter people out in the first few chapters until they get a taste and go, oh, okay, this can be about me. Yeah, maybe I'm not a Buddhist. I don't believe in that stuff. I don't even believe in religion, but he's talking about something that I can resonate with. So the feel of it for me, of finding that sweet spot where you can really touch people in a very human, direct way, and say, hey, you can get under your suffering. It feels really like what Buddha would have described as the middle way. It's not too much of this and it's not too much of that. It's just, walking that line to where the mind isn't grabbing a hold of it and going, that's me or that's not me. And I don't want the mind to do either one, really. I want to keep it in the middle. And so that it feels like maybe it's being satisfied or soothed. The ego feels like it has something to work with, it's getting somewhere. And yet what I'm really pointing to is underneath that, it's to the unconditioned, to the place where there is no coming or going, to where the problem of birth and death does not even need to be solved because it was never there. So for me, it's something like the middle way, something like being able to communicate in both the relative and absolute simultaneously, and having the flexibility to talk to people wherever they are. Another way of saying this is, I don't have the recipe for how you wake up, not you as the person interviewing me, but you as the listener, you do. And so I don't try to force any paradigm or structure on awakening on anyone. I literally listen to them, pay attention to them, open my heart to them. And at most I reflect, but I can accept fully and unequivocally where they are in the relative sense, as awake or asleep as they are, as absolute unfiltered reality that doesn't need to be fixed, changed, or anything, because that relative is also the absolute. So that's the key. The key is, you already have what you need to wake up. Of course you do. It's your true nature. You don't need my teaching. You don't need a doctrine. It's just a matter of learning to trust yourself in the right way. But it doesn't mean trusting your thoughts or beliefs, but really it doesn't even mean trusting your emotions as such. It means trusting an instinct or an intuition that goes beyond all of that we all have, because it is our true nature. So it's something like that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, for sure. I think I always equated awakening being the same or similar to liberation. However, in your book, you make a distinction. So what is the difference between awakening and liberation?
That's a great question. So now we'll get a little technical. So to me, but first of all, the way I'm going to describe this isn't like quote unquote the right way, because labels are just labels, right? So for instance, if you live in one country and I live in another country, we have a different word for chair, but we're both talking about a chair, right? So teachers that know, or even people who don't teach, but they have deep experiential insight and realization, they may use different words than the words I'm using. And I know teachers who do, and we're talking about the same insights. We're just using slightly different words, or different words for different stages. So this is just one way of using terminology for this. When I use the word awakening, I generally mean the first true shift in identity. Kensho is a word in Zen, or Satori. Also, you could often describe it as stream entry, depending on how you define it or how sort of deep that awakening is. But to me, it really is the first time identity actually shifts. And it can be a really big deal experientially. And sometimes it's experientially not that big of a deal, but instinctually it's a very big deal. Something has definitely changed. Up to that point, there are often pre-tastes of awakening, like something very real, very out of the extraordinarily real and extraordinarily intimate has occurred in your life, but they tend to remain in the experiential realm, lasting a few hours to maybe a couple of days, where I was in a type of presence or flow that I have never experienced before. And it was dramatically and markedly different than what it was like right before I went into it and right when I came out of it. And yet the person describing that to me often, it's clear that they are still perceiving themselves as the experiencer of that experience. And that is the key. When awakening happens, it may have those outward qualities of the mystical experience, the flow, the intimacy, the dissolution, even all this. But there's a key insight that is not any of those things that matters. And that is, I am looking at reality somehow from a different place than I was before. And it's very obvious that in a certain way, it can never really go back. It doesn't mean you're enlightened. And some people take this to be that they're enlightened, and that's a big mistake. But it usually, okay, it's definitely not like this whole process is over, but something has definitely fallen away. And I can't really put my finger on it, but things are different for sure. And yet they are also the same, and you start to hear this kind of paradoxical talk. But to me, that first shift that where identity has suddenly it's like you suddenly take yourself to be something different than you did before, and that something is much more vast and less needing of a definition. Actually, it's more free, more fluid, identity wise. That's what I usually call awakening, and I find that it typically does happen. It's on a spectrum. For some people, it's really earth shattering, and it's the biggest thing that'll happen in your life experientially. For other people, it's like, oh, wow, okay, something just completely changed, and I'm in a more clear, more authentic, more real and natural space than I was ever since maybe, excuse me, maybe as a small child. I kind of remember this, but I don't know if I was even making memories at that time. So people will say things like that. In Zen, it's pretty pretty well defined as kind of like your spiritual birth. It's really the first real step in a sense. And a good Zen teacher will tell you this, that you're experiencing, even though it's beyond anything you imagined before, this is just the beginning. You can expand this infinitely. And that's good teaching. And be humble, and be open to further insights and refinements. Another way of saying it is that this first shift is really de-identifying from the mind. It's seeing very clearly that you're not your mind. You're not the thoughts, and you're not what the thoughts define at all. But not just as a not just as an understanding, but as an instinctual, ongoing knowing. Oh, I'm not that. I'm not that. It's a falling away that just keeps happening. It's so it's a de-identification from thought. And the reason I say it that way is the next part, I'll sort of divide this into two major parts, the realization process. The sort of next shift, the big shift, out of identity altogether, is more like de-identifying from the body, or from form itself, from the physical world, from time and space. And that, I would, generally speaking, I would call liberation or enlightenment. That comes after a series, usually, of experiential insights that kind of build on one another, but they don't have to. For some people, it's just like click and everything's different, and it stays that way. It's like awakening, but clearer, and it doesn't go back. There's no self to reconstitute. There's no self to contract back into anymore. Nothing apart. There's no self apart. There's just the display of reality displaying however it does, with nothing apart from it, no watcher, no perception of it even, because it's just too intimate. But the real key to this, in my opinion, in my experience, is no self-realization, that anatta, that there is clearly and definitively no sense of self anymore. That's different than believing there's no self. A lot of people believe there's no self after like some, experiences and reading Buddhism and so forth. But there's that. Then there's the direct perception of no self that comes often with a deep awakening or sometime after awakening. But then to have absolutely no sense of self, well, there's not even anyone that could have it or not have it anymore. It's just a whole order of magnitude different. It's not better, and it's not an exalted state. It's not, there's just nothing that can be said about it. And yet it's completely natural. It's obvious that this is the only way it has ever been, the only way it ever could be. And it's like this for quote unquote everyone, but there aren't everyone's. There aren't, it's a very paradoxical thing to talk about. And yet it's very easy to say it from a conventional standpoint. But internally, like if I were to reflect internally, to think the thought and believe I am enlightened is the weirdest. It's a joke. It's like probably the biggest joke in the universe, because what enlightenment means is to see that there's no collector of experiences that solidifies into a sense of self at all. So I usually refer liberation as what I refer to as the sort of end of the separate self, complete end of it. And with that, generally speaking, you could say, depending on how you define it, but suffering ends. So personal suffering ends. That doesn't mean that you're not aware of the roots of suffering, and it also doesn't mean you're not aware of the suffering in the world, in the relative world, that humans, we cause a lot of suffering and we suffer a lot of suffering. In fact, you're more acute and aware of it. Actually, you can't ignore it at all. can't ignore how you could contribute to it by interacting with others in certain ways. That we humans, in the way we mind identify, we do perpetuate violence and that sort of thing. You can't ignore it. It's very obvious. So you're not in this sort of detached state of just the absolute, where there's nothing, there's no one, nothing happens, there's no suffering, there's no one to. That's kind of a phase you can go through, but that's not true enlightenment in my experience. True enlightenment is you really cannot make a distinction between the relative and absolute anymore at all. They're not even two things. It's very paradoxical, but does that give a general sense?
Yeah, for sure. I actually have a couple of more questions that were coming up. So I just want to check. So somebody who goes through an initial awakening, do they still feel a sense of separation? Is there still a sense of separation? They're still suffering. There is it just kind of like, now they're aware of the ego, now they're aware of the thoughts, now they're seeing it, and they're seeing it as separate. That's what this, would you say that's how it is?
That's very much how it is. Yes. And the vast majority of people, separation is a very specific insight, non-dual experience, the realization of non-duality, or the dissolving of the perceptual filter that says there's literally space, that there's objects apart from one another, that and underlying that is a subject object experience of me being the subject and everything else being the object. When those aren't there, that's what I would call non-separation. What's interesting is I notice right after awakening, often people are experiencing that, but it's it kind of comes and goes, it's fleeting, and they're so just in awe of the whole experience. And it's just so, it's such a, from a contrast standpoint, it's so different than how they were experiencing themselves before, that they can't even make a distinction between thoughts and non-separation and separation and objects and subject object. So I try not to confuse people with that stuff too much. Right after awakening, I usually just say, you have access to presence like you never did before. And they know that. And I say, just sit in that. Just really steep yourself in it for a while. Just enjoy it, because they know there's nothing to do. They can see that presence isn't something they're causing. Does that make sense? That's probably one of the biggest insights, is I don't have to cause presence to happen. It's already here. That's the beauty of that shift. That identity doesn't need to solve itself. It's okay. It's just fine the way it is. And so usually, yeah, at the very beginning, I kind of just encourage them not to conceptualize, not to try to look for other shifts and other insights and so forth, because it'll just be confusing at first, probably, when they're really in that flow state, which lasts weeks to a couple months, usually, sometimes longer. But they know instinctually that the conditioning is starting to come back. They can feel it. They also know now that the thoughts aren't real, but they also see themselves re-identifying with thoughts from time to time. But the fact that they can see that happening is so important. That's grace. It's not comfortable, but it has to happen for this process to clarify itself and to continue to perpetuate. The parts of our experience we weren't seeing, the hidden parts, the shadow realm, the repressed emotions, all that, they kind of have to come into consciousness let's just say, to integrate. And so, yeah, you're not that you're not suffering, it's that you're seeing what suffering is very clearly. You do know what suffering is then. I think after an awakening, it's intuitively becoming pretty obvious what suffering actually is. Maybe not the full mechanism, but you can see what it is, and you can see that you've been doing it to yourself, and that's all important. But there's this weird thing where you watch yourself do it to yourself, and you can't not do it. It's a very bizarre thing that people go through after awakening, but they have to go through it, and they know they have to go through it, which is good. And it's that working through the conditioning. It just has to happen for a while, and it's uncomfortable. It's that post-awakening phase after the honeymoon period's gone. It's a mixture of periods of peace and flow and presence, intense presence, and periods of like contraction and discomfort, and seeing how much conditioning is actually there, which you were able to conveniently ignore before awakening, but now you can't. So yeah, they're still suffering, but it's coming and going. It's lighter. generally speaking, but it's more obvious. And that's, again, I think it's grace. It has to be that way, because now we can't hide things from ourselves anymore. They have to come into consciousness. We have to work with them. And mostly what we're really learning to do is work from non-resistance, is to live from non-resistance. But to do that, you first have to see the resistance. You have to see that you're the one resisting you as what you take yourself to be, even though identity now has shifted, and you can kind of get behind even that identity. And that's the key to all of this. So that's usually there. The sense of separation and living in a world of objects is there. However, some people, I don't know if it's psychological or it's just conditions based, some people really click into non-dual easily. Like, like I had a retreat in July. I was just at my house. Like, I don't know, we had 10 people or something. And for whatever reason, my lectures or my talks were just on non-dual a lot. And by the end, like half the people there were literally experiencing things in a non-dual way. So it's a mental process that makes things seem dualistic. And if you really investigate it, it's not really that hard to get under that after awakening. But for it to completely stabilize to where you really don't experience separation anymore at all, and it's just this crystal clear, non-spacious intimacy, that takes, again, a few further insights before that's obvious. So yeah, and as one continues to investigate the perceptual filters that keep the sense of reactive self operating, the sense of relational self, the sense of self apart from objects, as we undermine these insights or clarify and see that they were never really there, they were always illusory, then that's when you start to notice, oh my gosh, suffering really is dropping away truly. The sense of being a personal sufferer is dropping away because strangely, because I don't feel like I live in a world anymore where I have to constantly maneuver to attenuate suffering. It's like there's, I've said before, suffering ends when you stop trying to end suffering, but you have to do it authentically through insight. Yeah. And then after that, the sense of duality will actually collapse at some point. And really often the only thing that's left is a very subtle self sense, but you can see very clearly that there's nothing for it to refer to anymore. There's no separate self. There's no subject. In fact, there's not really objects, right? With non-duality being clear, there's not even perceiving. There's just like vivid non-dual experience. So from then on, the sense of separate self, the sense of a subtle self sense that can just kind of be hanging around because of the momentum of, I guess, mind or habit, it tends to just fall away, and it can happen suddenly or it can kind of fade away slowly. But that's the most fundamental sense of identity of any kind, that identity itself even exists. And yeah.
So to me, it seems like liberation, I feel like it would be easier to understand because you could just be like, oh, there's no longer suffering. So it's like, there's no suffering. But because there's still suffering after awakening, to me, that's like a little harder to understand. And I don't know if I'm just trying to map myself and like kind of, I guess I could share kind of what I went through. Mm-hmm. I had really profound experiences using 5-MeO DMT. You sure you heard of it? Toad venom. It's just very like ego dissolving experiences. And the way that I feel like I definitely feel like there was like, it was a mystical experience, right? It was just a mystical experience. Like I recognize that in retrospect, but there was definitely a shift. There was definitely like a before and after. There was definitely a no going back. Like after that, it was like, there's no going back. And there was like, I remember the first day, like just going to the gym and I felt like I was in the Matrix. I'm just like, this is so fake. This looks so fake. And it was just, but to me, like the conditioning, the mind identification, the sense of separation is still there. I went through Ingram's work, and like the way I mapped it was the way he explains the arising and the passing away. I don't know if you've read his book or went through like the stages, how he maps them. But like, to me, that was the arising and passing away. I'm like, okay, it's this big experience. It's like this crazy thing. There might be the sense of not going back, but it is an awakening and it isn't stream entry, but then it's like some of the things you say, like, it does feel like there's like a significant shift. It does feel like I'm way more aware of the mind.
Mhm.
It does. I don't know. I can't go back, so I don't really remember how I felt. There's always been suffering, but I felt like I became more cognizant of my suffering and of suffering in the world. Like it felt like the one thing I would say, it's like life became like way more painful,
Mhm.
but also way more beautiful. Like there was like a huge, like the spectrum of like how I feel, and like it just like widened.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I don't know, that's just, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. Like to me, the way I look at awakening, it's like if you're not suffering no more and you're like able to serve fully, where you're not like, I got to take care of myself, I feel bad, like I don't feel good, like like that to me is the way I look at it. That's why like the awakening, liberation, I just put them together. Like I always put them together, so when you presented it this way, it was just like very different, and then it made me think like, what's going on in my experience? Like I'm wondering, like, are there people that are awakened and don't know they're awakened?
um, I've met a few people who've had an awakening, who, especially if it's distant, they definitely know something shifted, something happened. But because of the place you find yourself post awakening, you're more and more disinclined to label yourself anything often, because it doesn't make things don't stick like that. Now, some people are. Some people will say, I had this insight, then I had this one. Like it's a collection of experiences. That's fine. That's the way they process. But of many people, it just doesn't make sense to even talk that way. And I was one of them. Like for years, I just would, I mean, I knew damn well that I saw reality and experienced it different than I think most people did. But I also knew there was no reason for me to say that or talk about it, or not that anyone was having a wrong experience. It just didn't matter. Um, but yeah, so I've met a few people who've had shifts that I would consider a true shift in identity, and they kind of discount it. But here's the thing. This is again paradoxical. My chapter on paradox kind of goes into a lot of detail about this, because the deeper realization goes, the more paradoxical everything becomes. And paradox is wonderful. It's just great because reality is paradoxical. But it is paradoxical to say this, but it's true that although I would say there are in the relative events called awakening and non-dual realization and even no self-realization, liberation, when I talk with people, I always tell them, don't worry about it. Don't think of it. Don't worry about the event. You don't need to make it into an event. It's not a goal. I only work in the moment. When I'm working with someone directly, I tell them, don't worry about it. I don't see you as having had an awakening or not, or liberated or not. I can't see reality divided up that way. It's just not divided up like that. So whatever's happening is just happening. And out of this conversation, shifts can happen. And that's great, and that's what just goes down. But it doesn't actually matter. Like when I'm working with, say, a given individual, especially after awakening, they tend to move all over the map. Like they'll almost feel mind identified, and then they feel like quite empty and liberated. And then they feel like, they're working with the dualistic constructs of the mind, but I can just flow with wherever they are. And that's fine. That's what we do. We just it's like a dance, so it doesn't actually matter what happened in the past or future, because there is no past and future, and reality is not in the past and future. So whatever, it doesn't even matter, honestly. But the way you describe it, yeah, that's kind of like the post awakening thing. And like I said, some people, it's a huge deal, they'll put a lot of labels on what happened and talk about it endlessly. Other people are like, no, there was something that just definitely changed, and it didn't go back. But yeah, I'm still a person. I still feel like a person. I still feel like I'm an object, like I feel like I'm walking through 3-dimensional space, and there's objects over there and I'm over here. I can't pretend that I don't see it that way. And I still feel suffering sometimes. And yet there's actually a tremendous amount of fluctuation, right? Where sometimes it feels super contracted and like, who the hell, what is going on? Maybe this is all nonsense, like massive doubt. Other times it's just free. It's like flow state, freedom. There's nothing to even think about. There's nothing to concern myself with. There's nothing to orient toward. It's just peace. It's just, beautiful. And that's very typical of after awakening, is like that. It's kind of like a roller coaster ride. But yeah, so I do point out that there's kind of those phases. There's pre-awakening, there's post-awakening, and then liberation's a whole other ball game. And I think the majority of people who go through awakening maybe don't go through all those other experiential insights all the time, but probably because they don't have good pointing. That's my guess. That's why that's why I wrote the book. That's why I was really particular about how I worded everything. And I really because I know if someone has had an awakening, there's no reason they can't see through these other perceptual barriers. But the weird thing is, post-awakening, it's like they're so subtle. You know, these perceptual things are so subtle and they're so fleeting, and the mind is tricky. You know, the thoughts are still there and they can be confusing. It's kind of like a house of mirrors, right? So it's like, where do you actually look? But it turns out it's not that hard to find where to look and how to look. It's just a matter of being willing to see subtleties more than and stay out of your mind. You know, the cognitive, that's the danger with talking about maps and stages, is it's so easy to turn that into a mental map, and unbeknownst to ourselves, use that mental map to actually avoid presence right now. Why would we want to avoid presence? Well, here's the really weird thing. Presence is peaceful, and it's presence is dissolution, and it's no self. But presence is also contraction. Presence has infinite flavors to it. It's not bound to be only pleasurable. That's what we miss. And there's an assumption we make early in life. Of course we do. And our mind always makes it. The thoughts always make it. And that is, I'm always trying to feel better and always trying to avoid feeling worse. But that really, we have to look really closely at that specifically after awakening. And there are some insights that interestingly there's one insight specifically that interestingly is the one that probably reduces suffering the most, personal suffering the most. And that's the shift into equanimity. But what's interesting about it is the way you investigate it is very counterintuitive. It's not a deep samadhi type investigation. It's not a meditative thing. It's actually down and dirty life. It's like, look at what actually what triggers you in life the most. And you got to like just be honest with yourself. Be like, what triggers me? Is it my relationship with my loved ones? Is it work, my boss? Is it the government? Whatever it is, you know, look at those things that really trigger you and start to feel into the cognitive distortion that comes up that says this. It says, this is how reality is. Right now, it's just like this. This is the way it is. Just like it's the way it sounds, the way it feels, the way it looks. This is what's actually happening. And this is what my mind says should be happening, right? And that little mistake, it's not a mistake, it's just the way our minds operate. But the buy-in we have, it leads to a sense of doership. It leads to a sense of the one who has agency that can make me feel better, that can fix the problem in my life. It perpetuates that through thought. And so when we actually follow the breadcrumbs like backwards to where they started, and you'll find this place where you realize, oh my God, whenever I look at life exactly how it is, and I tell myself that's how it is, yeah, sure, but that's not how it should be. I can make it different than it is. Like, no, you can't make what's happening right now different than what's happening right now. You'll never, ever, ever be able to do that. And yet through the magic of thought, we really kind of convince ourselves we can. That's the root of suffering. And so, as I said, it's counterintuitive, this particular insight, because you actually have to go back into discomfort. You go in the moment, you when you're doing this and you're really putting yourself like over the coals on this, you'll realize like, oh my God, I've been doing this for years. I've been convincing myself that what's actually happening is not happening, or I can make it not happen, or I can make it less happening when I know damn well I can't. And to realize that, it causes a little bit of discomfort. It's kind of like if you could bottle human discomfort into a jar and then drink a drink of it, it's kind of like raw discomfort. It's not torture, but it's not comfortable. It's this place we don't want to be. And the willingness to actually be there while doing this kind of good inquiry of noticing, oh, this is how it is. And this is how I think it could be. And then this little flip can happen where all of a sudden you realize like, oh my God, I've been looking at the world as how it could be moment to moment, most of the time, instead of how it actually is. No wonder I'm suffering. Yeah. So being willing to go back and look at this kind of stuff. But again, when you've had mystical experiences and you've went through awakening and all this, and everyone that talks about meditation and awakening talks about not having suffering, this is the last place you'd think to look, but it's the place you have to look to really get under that fundamental mistake that makes it so that we don't recognize equanimity is actually always here. Does that make sense?
For sure. So Can you explain how you explain in your book what a thought is, and expand on the reflective nature of thoughts? I thought
Sure.
that part was really fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thoughts are a fascinating phenomenon. In that, as I mentioned in the book somewhere, you know, if you think about it, no one in the world had a parent sit them down at like 7 years old and say, listen, by the time you're 20, your constant companion in life, there's going to be someone standing next to you all the time, talking in your ear, telling you what you think, what you believe, telling you who you are and who you're not, telling you what you're afraid of. They're going to be there all the time. So I want to warn you, you're going to listen to this person more than you listen to your lover, more than you listen to your boss. It is going to be there all the time, chattering away at you. It's called thoughts. No one ever tells us that's going to happen, right? Isn't that weird? And yet it is true. How often do people talk about thoughts? Not really that often. It's like this secret we keep where we're always engaging our inner world, but then we kind of engage the outer world with some kind of persona that's a little fake, right? No wonder we're fucking, like no wonder we're suffering. Like we're so, inauthentic in a certain way. So thoughts are so fascinating because they're so prevalent in everyone's experience, and yet it's this like thing we hide away a little bit, right? So anyway, starting from there, as realization progresses, especially after that first big shift, it changes a lot as far as our understanding of thought, right? So as realization progresses, our understanding and experience of thought evolves a lot. And even after liberation, it's very interesting how it evolves. It gets to a place that's so hard to talk about with thoughts. But initially, what I would say, if somebody wants to just look and see what a thought is, I would say start by reminding yourself in the moment that you're looking into what a thought is right now. Remind yourself that there's actually no past or future in this moment, right? In this exact moment, the only way there could be a past and future, well, I can't make one happen, but I can imagine one, right? So let's look right in this moment and see what's actually here then, right? If it's not a past and future, which are only thought-based, there's only what's happening. Well, there's only 5 senses. There's sensation, there's sound, the visual experience, there's smell and taste, right? That's clearly here. And there's some other thing going on, this chattering going on, or this self-reflection, or this sense of me, or if, from an Advaita standpoint, it might be the pure sense of I am, or even where that I am is emanating from, that sense of I is emanating from. So just an experience of, let's say, consciousness, thought, consciousness, etc. So you can actually investigate directly what a thought is empirically for yourself. If you just sit for a moment and just say, okay, I just want to notice the next thought that comes, right? And the thought is, it's not the sensations, it's not the sounds, it's not the visual experience, the smell or taste. It's just whatever else comes that's not those. And you might notice, oh, I just saw an image of myself, I don't know, eating breakfast in my mind, right? And then you just investigate, well, what's that made out of? What is it? Like, how could I explain that to someone who's never had a thought? Like there is anyone, but if you were to explain what a thought is to someone who's never had a thought, you'd say, okay, so you see how you're sitting in this room here? Yes. You can see, me, and you see the room. Yeah, I see the room, and you hear things and so forth. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now imagine that you can actually see something like this, but it's not happening right here, but you can see it like on a movie screen inside your head. And they'd say, what? You'd say, yeah, that's what a thought is. You can actually experience what seems like the senses, but it's not the senses as they're appearing right now. It's kind of like the senses as they appeared maybe what seems like a moment ago, or that kind of thing. So so in that empirical way, you can look into it and see that the thoughts are ultimately a reflection of the senses, right? What is the thought made out of? There's a recently characterized phenomenon called aphantasia. Have you heard of this?
I feel like I heard that, but I'm
Yeah.
blanking on what that is.
Well, aphantasia means some people they can't actually make a mental visual image in their mind at all.
Okay. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they literally can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so interesting about this is because of the nature of human communication, we didn't even know this was happening for a long time, including the people who have it. So when I heard about this, I started watching some documentaries or some sort of lectures by neurologists who study it and talk to people who have it. And one of them said he's found that about 1 out of 100 people have visual aphantasia. So I was like, well, I can probably find one then if 1 out of 100. So I went one day, I was at work and I started asking everybody to imagine an apple. And then I kind of went through the thing, and I found 2 different people in one day who literally they don't have an ability to imagine anything visually. So once I found them, I was like, asking all kinds of questions. I'm like, okay, well, what did you think they were talking about, like in first grade when the teacher said, okay, everyone imagine something? And they said, I never really knew what they were talking about. I thought they meant imagine like the word, the concept, like the verbal concept apple. So so one of the 2 people I talked to was very interesting. I told her, I said, would it surprise you to know people I can actually visualize that? Like can like literally see it in their mind, like they see it in front of their eyes. And she was like, is that really true? Do people really see things in their mind? And I said, people see things in their mind that look more real than what's right in front of their eyes a lot of times, but that's a good example of how a visual thought, an image is really just a reflection of a sense, right? And so then the other very common part of thought is narrative, right? The self-narrative, self-talk, which apparently some other people with aphantasia have a minimal amount of that or none at all. They don't have an internal dialogue. They say.
So are they suffering? It seems like they're like free of thoughts.
What's here's something that's really interesting about that. Specifically to the image one, this neurologist who had interviewed many people with this disorder, or maybe it's not even a disorder really, but he asks them one question and they universally say that it's true of them. And he says, do you notice it's easy for you to move on? Like if you break up with someone, and they all say, oh, absolutely. I just don't think about them. I don't have an image of them, so I don't grieve. One guy even said, my mother passed away. And he said it was very sad while I was going through it with my sisters and whatever. He said, but after that, it was gone. Like I don't grieve her until I talk to my sisters and I feel their grief sort of by, whatever. And he said, what I noticed though, is like, if I look at a picture of her, I feel a lot of grief. He said, but I don't look at a picture of her. He said, I know I love her still, and I know she's not here, but I don't feel like grief, So people who have visual aphantasia, apparently they really don't hold on to lost loved ones or broken up relationships and that sort of thing nearly as much as people who do have, the majority of people who have this mental image in their minds. But it kind of shows you that we're actually grieving something that's not there in a sense, right? It's like we're taking what we're imagining to be, in a sense, almost more real than what's right in front of our eyes, right? And so this gets, as we go deeper in realization, this gets to the heart of what identification is actually all about, what identity is even all about. Because when we start to see, oh, I'm not the thoughts, I'm not the images, there's not a whole lot going on anymore. When we're not looking at the reflections in the mind and you're only looking at what's right in front of your face, if you're really honest with yourself, there aren't labels there because those are memories. There isn't concept there because the concepts about objects are memories, they're learned. It starts looking very different, actually. Separation, boundaries, all these things are learned. They're ultimately thoughts, but they become subtle thoughts. They become thoughts on which other thoughts are built. And that's the sort of quote unquote conceptual thoughts, where you could say, well, it's not really a visual image. It's not really a dialogue, but if you unpack it, it ultimately is. It's a reflection of reflections. So in the book, I described that thoughts are a reflection of the visual sense, a reflection of the auditory sense, which narrative and that sort of thing. And you can imagine sensations, these things can happen and sometimes they're there more prominently for some people, but generally like smell and taste, you don't usually imagine them too much, except maybe right before you're ready to eat and so forth. But the majority of our internal experience is the auditory and visual soundscape that is reflected. However, as thought becomes more complex, and as I describe in the book, it becomes very complex very early in life. By the time you're 4 years old, you know how to manipulate other people because you know they have an inner world and you know how to manipulate their inner world. You can change the visual experience and the belief experience other people are having in their mind to your advantage at 4 years old, called theory of mind, right? We have brain centers that do this. So thought becomes very complex very early. And what I would describe as what makes thought actually very complex, not very, but what makes thought become increasingly complex is that thoughts can reflect all of the 5 senses, let's say, but they can actually also reflect other thoughts. So consciousness has this ability to self-reflect and into a series of thoughts. And by the time we're in our early 20s, that's the world we live in. We live in a house of mirrors of thoughts reflecting thoughts. However, we've become identified with them. And that's that place that can become exquisitely uncomfortable for people, and why they take up these practices and so forth. So yeah, that's ultimately what it is. I think thoughts are reflective in nature, and the clearer it becomes what thought and consciousness actually is, what the substance of consciousness is and how it functions, it becomes very obvious that it has a reflective nature to it. But it doesn't have to be experienced in a reflective way. You can actually learn to experience consciousness as non-reflective knowingness. Might be called like consciousness rigpa or something. I don't know Dzogchen very well, but I just call it unbound consciousness, or non-polarized consciousness, where there's no subject object experience in consciousness. It's just like pure knowing, or the pure light of knowing shining only on itself, let's say. So consciousness is a fascinating thing where it can form a sense of self, the thinker, and the objects of thought very easily. And it can even become identified in that through momentum, but it can also back out of all that, take the backward step into just that pure sense of knowingness with no thought at all.
Yeah. That part of your book really resonated. I also like it was like a litmus test to see if something's a thought. Like, can you write it down? If you could write it down, then it's a thought. And then, you were talking about the reflective thing and then unbound consciousness. And I was just seeing that in my experience. And it was like, there was like a shift in that. And I really like that part of the book. Something else you said that also has been coming up for me is the fact that we don't teach kids about thoughts. I have two young kids, and I was thinking about this week, probably because I was like going through your book, reading it. And I'm just like, how do you explain this to my son? Like, listen, this is what happens. Your brain is just going to be chattering, and like, you don't have to identify with that. And like, you don't have to believe like 99% of the time, like whatever's there is just like, it's nothing. It's just noise. Mm-hmm. So like that, I feel like that's so important. Like learning about thoughts and emotions, like that's the most important thing we should learn about. Yet they don't teach that in school. And like most people don't even learn that as adults.
I totally agree with you.
Can you explain what is spiritual materialism and whether it's an inevitable part of walking the path or the awakening process?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is sort of inevitable because seeking to various degrees will go on for quite some time as the spiritual unfolding occurs. It may not go on in a really gross way after awakening, like it may calm down tremendously, but the sense of trying to make ourselves feel better, trying to move toward a more desirable or enjoyable experience and away from a less desirable or enjoyable experience, that's going to go on in the mind. And this stuff's a bit tricky to talk about because I really want to make a distinction between the mind and the body from a conventional standpoint. The body's always going to prefer one flavor of tea over another, let's say, or it's going to prefer eating something that it enjoys versus physical pain. That's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where identity comes into play. And identity comes into play, again, very early in life, and it's very deeply rooted in the way we process. And its most fundamental movement really is trying to make itself feel better, trying to, move towards something desirable and away from something not so desirable. Well, the most enjoyable thing that the ego ever gets a hold of is a spiritual experience, a mystical experience, and an awakening. Not the core of what actually happens. Like at the very core of presence, let's say, it doesn't really have a core, but at the very core of presence, there's actually no one standing apart from it going, oh, this is so cool, and how do I reproduce it? It's actually not like that. But as long as there's a remnants of ego left, it's going to come in and put its stamp on it and go, oh, boom. First of all, I did that. I did something to get that to happen. And second of all, I could recreate it. Let's figure out how to do that. You could call that spiritual materialism. Ultimately, part of us is going to want to chase pleasurable experiences for a while. Now, what's interesting is I find sometimes I say, like, people will ask me how I teach or something, and I don't really have a style or a way that I teach. Well, I probably do, but I don't know what it is. But I can tell you let's say subjectively, it's something like, I really just feel fixations. Like if somebody's working directly with me and we're going through this process and they're going through whatever they're going through, what I usually feel is fixation, because reality doesn't fixate. And I feel, and it can be any kind of fixation. It can fixate this way, that way, in the masculine and the feminine, it can fixate in the mentality, in the mind, and in concepts. It can fixate in even in the non-conceptual. So the fixation tendency of let's say the separate self, for lack of a better way of describing it, goes on for a while until it completely stops. And that, to me, kind of like the signature of liberation, experientially. But it gets subtler and subtler and subtler. That's the key, is to be willing to be open to subtler and subtler movements of fixation, and not fight them, but inquire into what is the perception there, what's going on, that sort of thing. So as fixations get subtler, they get more obscured, but at the same time, the undermining of a fixation has almost in a sense, a more of a profound effect. The clarity just keeps deepening and deepening, and it's amazing. But every time that happens, to a certain point, up to a point, every time that happens, there's a little bit of I'll just call it an egoic reflex that goes, "Ooh, that was cool. That was a great insight." That it just happens, right? It's the way our minds are sort of wired, and it wants to hold on to it somehow, wants to hold on. So at some point, it just clicks that as these realizations get subtler, as we orient more and more to non-fixation, to impermanence, and so forth, we trust that the dissolution itself, the releasing activity itself, is sort of innate to reality. Reality is always releasing and never holds anything. And then I don't know, like almost like a critical mass hits, where it's like, oh, it's obvious, it's self-perpetuating, and that you don't need me to point anymore. You don't need anything. In one sense, everything is pointing to it. Everything is pointing to dissolution. Everything is pointing to impermanence right here, right now, in crystal clear intimacy. And it's just so beautiful. It doesn't mean that it's over. It doesn't mean that the awakening is over, or the process is over in the relative sense. In a body mind, it's always going to deepen, but it carries itself inward from then on, which is beautiful. It's like realization is now approached from a place of spontaneity, complete and true spontaneity, instead of a place of doership as the agent, as the spiritual person, as the whatever. And that's when spiritual materialism is like, you just see through it. You just see, oh, okay, that was just the way the mind was moving. It was just trying to collect experiences. Now, I will say that, as I mentioned with the fixation thing, some people do fixate pretty strongly this way. Some people really try to collect experiences for whatever reason. It's not bad, or there's different. Yeah, it's like, I want this experience, and we tend to like talk about those experiences like a currency of telling your friends about how this one and that one, and fine. It's like, be kind to yourself and realize it's human nature. Of course, we want to feel good, but there's something that feels better than good, and that's just complete mystery. It's a mystery. It's a non-holding, non-fixation. It's indeterminacy. Indeterminacy itself, so absolutely liberating and freeing, and it can't hold on. It doesn't hold on to any experience, because then it has to be ready for the next experience, is one way of saying it. But it's just a willingness to just live in complete aliveness. And yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. I feel like I've been going through the spiritual materialism, like after I had the Toad experiences, like I couldn't stop talking about it for 2 years. Like any person I met or anybody else, like that would be the main kind of thing I wanted to speak about, until it just kind of burned itself out. And I just started seeing like, okay, like, why are you speaking about this? Why are you bringing, like, it just burned itself out. And then you just see kind of like these patterns, and they become more evident. But it's just fascinating how the ego just like, it will attach to anything. Like it becomes a spiritual ego, and it's like more subtle and more refined. And it's like, I think there was a couple of things you said, like as insight progresses, it becomes less spiritual. Like the whole experience of awakening, it becomes less spiritual, and there becomes less of a sense of specialness.
Mhm.
Because like the specialness is, that's the sense of self. Like it happened to me. I'm somehow more special than everybody else. And then like you just start seeing like how that's just nonsense.
Yeah, a
And
lot of this comes down to psychological stuff because we, of course, we all want to be special in a sense,
yeah.
right? As I watch it, like with even the dogs, they feel jealousy when you give one dog attention, the other one wants to come up. And saying they feel jealousy is projecting human stuff onto them, but they act that way, right? They vie for attention from the person who feeds them or whatever. So there's some developmental stage in our life where it's important that we are noticed by the one we have a primary bond with and those sorts of things. But the way consciousness works, it just echoes things infinitely into adulthood where they're just not even relevant anymore. But it's interesting. The specialness thing is true. And one thing I'll sometimes say about specialness is like a double-edged sword, because in one sense you want to be special, but in another sense, being special is separate from everything. And that's suffering. The other thing I wanted to say is from what you just reflecting on what you just said was that a lot of times you can unpack these things a little bit and look for like psychological mechanisms that are just very human and simple, like comparing experiences with, I have no idea if this is your experience at all, but comparing experiences with others, sometimes in people that do it a lot, or even in communities that tend to do it, I've seen, I sense a competition, a competitiveness that's like repressed. Like they don't see that they're being competitive, but they kind of maybe are, or just wanting to fit in, a sense of, wanting to fit in, wanting to get approval. It's a lot of stuff comes down to validation. We want validation, and that's wired into us, that survival has to do with acceptance, right? In the world we live in today, if you don't get validation, you're probably not going to starve. But if you believe in evolution and, we evolved in small bands of primates and so forth, to lose validation to a certain degree could mean death. If you're like ostracized from the group, you don't have protection, So it is sort of wired into us as a survival mechanism to want to fit in and need validation. So you don't have to make any of that wrong. If you find the stuff going on, it's just a matter of just looking in and going, oh, okay. Oh, I see. That's why that's happening. Okay. And yet at the same time that's happening, the clarity is still here, right? It's when we don't see it and it's a hidden place that it has a polarity to it, and it keeps us kind of ping pong balling. But when we see it clearly for what it is, you can just be fully human and realize that's the relative world, and it lines up. All of a sudden, it like lines up with the absolute world. It's like, boom, that's it. Nothing to fix. So.
Is meditation necessary for awakening? Why is it that some people can spend 20 to 30 years meditating and not wake up? I noticed that like your approach is so, like, you speak about practicing and like technique and these kind of things, but it seems like you're so into the natural flow. Like it's not about being regimented, like having this tight schedule. That was kind of like refreshing to me, coming from being more of like, I have to meditate 2 hours a day. I can't miss a meditation. Coming from reading Choladas' The Mind Illuminated and Daniel Ingram's Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And it's like very much about maps and these are the 5 hindrances and which one of them is popping up, and like just super technical and why. And then your approach is just so natural. So like maybe you could expand on your approach to meditation and is it necessary for awakening, and
Sure.
why it doesn't always work. Yeah.
I love that question. So one thing I felt to say at the outset is that there are times when I might recommend to somebody that they're more regimented about practice, meditation, inquiry. What's interesting about what you just said is like, again, so many paradoxes in this stuff, and the ego loves to co-opt everything. So the person who's probably the most obsessed with being regimented and mapping and all that sort of thing. Well, there are a lot, I'm not you, but I mean, like there are a lot of people like that, but that type of psychological makeup, those are the ones I'm going to point in the other direction. I'm going to point them more to the naturalness, the let's say even the feminine aspect, the willingness instead of the will, as Adyashanti might say it. On the other hand, you have to have some intention to actually recognize that you're suffering and be willing to do something and work, right? So a lot of this stuff again comes to the middle way. What's interesting though is about meditation specifically, is I'm personally not against it at all. I love to meditate, and I do meditate. Um, if anything, I was of the makeup to believe that practicing hard equals being realized. Like, and the more you practice, I would even, this is many years ago, but I would look at, like, I don't know, Dogen or these Zen masters. I mean, like, they must have meditated like 8 hours a day for 70 years or something, right? Like, it's just the way the masculine mind's hooked up, right? The harder you work, the more you get, the more, but I think I probably put it in my book somewhere. Like, if just exerting yourself in extreme and painful ways made you enlightened, then every ultra marathoner would be enlightened, but they're not. So yeah, practice. And so meditation specifically does not equal awakening. And I know that, and it's not an opinion. I know it from experience, because I've seen people wake up very quickly who actually don't like to meditate at all, but they inquire like crazy. Like, I can think of a couple people, and they were all about inquiry. They were all about awakening and seeing through the illusion of separation and all that, but they didn't care to meditate at all. So there you go. The majority of people I work with definitely meditate, have meditation practice and that sort of thing. But on the other end of the spectrum, as you mentioned, there are people who meditate for years and years and years, and they don't wake up. So awakening really is about intention. It really is. You have to be willing. Well, you have to care that there's a way out of suffering. You have to be willing to go through what you're going to have to go through for this process to evolve. And everyone I know who's deeply realized, everyone I know personally who's deeply realized, has gone through a lot of emotional pain. It's not an easy thing to go through at times, but a willingness to go through that, even though you can't know exactly what that's going to mean or how it's going to unfold, but a willingness is key. If your whole practice is about trying to feel good, and that's really all it's about, that's probably not the person who's going to necessarily wake up fastest. Someone who's like, I don't care what I feel, what I go through, what I see. I don't care what a repressed emotion comes. I want to see the truth, period. I want to see the living truth, because I believe there is some, and probably the most important thing is, and I believe that I don't already know it, right? I believe whatever beliefs I have, they may be suspect. They may be totally wrong. They may be making me suffer. That's someone who's wired to wake up, So I generally would recommend meditation. Of course, it calms the mind, calms the body, for sure. But don't convince yourself that that's the only thing that is required to wake up. I think you have to be sort of committed to living truth.
So to me, I kind of feel like self-inquiry is a type of meditation. But so you still need some kind of practice, right? Because self-inquiry, you could be doing it while you're washing the dishes or while you're doing relative tasks.
Yeah.
But it's the fact that you're like attentively watching. So like how is self-inquiry different than meditation?
That's a great question. You absolutely can do self-inquiry while you meditate. If I said self-inquiry, I'll back up and just say there's a broader term I use, which is inquiry, and it's not always self-inquiry. Yeah. At first, especially if you're working on that first shift, self-inquiry is what I would point to. It's one of the things I would recommend if it resonates with somebody. There's other ways to go about it, but that is self-inquiry into the nature of self. And a very good way of understanding that is just read Ramana Maharishi's book. He describes it very clearly what he's talking about, and it's quite simple. But you kind of have to be ruthless with it. You have to really care about the answer and keep digging in. And that really can get someone across through that first gate, that first barrier. Beyond that, there's other types of inquiry that aren't self-inquiry necessarily. Especially once you really see, you really have the insight that you're not going to find a separate self anywhere. You're just not going to find it, and you're not going to find it, and you lose some interest in looking for it in a sense. Then self-inquiry is not really that powerful, I don't think. But again, from the standpoint of like Neo-Advaita, Ramana Maharishi, Nisargadatta, they would say it's still valuable to just rest in the sense of I am. It's fine. That's one way to go. But I would point people to inquire into different aspects of what seemed to formulate a self in the first place. So separation, the equanimity stuff. So there's different ways to inquire that are not self-inquiry. So I just want to clarify that first. When you're working with that first shift and you really are absorbing yourself into self-inquiry, it does help to do it during meditation, really, because you can get into a deep absorption, like a samadhi with it, to where the mind gets very, very quiet and the thoughts are starting to space out. And that's where magic happens. After that, you can do inquiry during meditation as part of your meditative practice for sure. It's fine. But other inquiries you can literally do walking around. You can do sitting in a chair. And many people, examples that are coming to mind of people I know who made that non-dual shift did it wide awake. Sitting there staring at a wall, looking at a cup, sitting on a plane, looking at a seat. I've heard all these things, or just walking around, riding your bike. I try not to recommend people do this while driving, but probably could happen then too. I actually do know somebody who worked on it while they're driving. So yeah, the later inquiries, once you've had a shift or some insight, you start to recognize presence and sort of absorption can kind of also happen when you're wide awake. You don't have to be in a deep meditative state. This is once you've taken practice off the mat, right? When you realize it's not a compartmentalized thing I do. Spirituality isn't my little thing I do 1 hour a day or 2 hours a day. It's kind of a responsibility like all day long in a sense. Now, you don't want to beat yourself up about that because the mind still is going to get a hold of you here and there, and you're not going to be able to focus 24/7. But you certainly can start to do these practices wide awake, taking care of business. And there's a sort of shift that starts to happen where they become enjoyable. You do it out of true curiosity, like truly curious. Well, what is a boundary? How do I know that there's a boundary anywhere? How do I know there's a subject experiencing an object? What am I taking reference from? Right. So is inquiry a practice? Sure. But it's really a practice from the standpoint of a practicer. Once the practicer starts to dissolve, what I like to say is if you're doing inquiry properly, if someone's pointed you to do it inquiry properly, or you've learned by your own instinct to do it properly, you'll notice that as identity structures fall away, you are already doing something that's already always happening anyway. So I could say inquiry is always happening, but it's not a specific question. It doesn't need a specific answer, but it's always looking. I'm always looking. There's a curiosity and a fascination with reality that's just ongoing all the time. So done properly, inquiry just sort of coalesces into this place that I described earlier, where realization just continues to carry itself inward and onward spontaneously. It's the spontaneity, the curiosity, the fascination, and the non-dual, non-formless nature of reality are all the same thing. Does that make sense? So inquiry, is it a practice? Sure, it's a practice until it's not. Until it's just absolutely, what is there to do but enjoy this? It's not even an enjoyer though, right? So again, paradox.
Can you speak?
There are meditative practices that I might recommend that are not specifically inquiry too, for sure. To just calm the mind, calm the body, natural meditation, which Shikantaza, if you're a Zen person. Resting in pure consciousness, but that's also, you could probably say resting in the sense of I am. But there are meditative practices also, of course, you can use a mantra, body scanning, whatever, that are not directly inquiry, I suppose. Anyway, I wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah, going through your book definitely made me look at meditation a lot less rigidly, which is very helpful because one of my kids is almost 2.5. The other one is 7 months. And it's becoming more harder to have a longer, like regimented practice. So it's like, I got to practice right now, changing this diaper. So your approach is just, I tend to be very structured. I like structure. I like discipline. I like routine. So I see that it's helpful for me to lean into the perspective I feel you show a lot. Can you speak about, this is another interesting part. This is fascinating to me. Can you speak about beliefs, how they work, where they come from, and the role they play in the awakening process?
Sure. Yeah. I could almost say, if there's one thing anyone could do to just wake themselves up, and people I have sort of come in contact with, or maybe seen videos of, that sort of did it on their own in a way, or just figured it out, or maybe intuited it. It's what they really are doing is they're inquiring into and undermining beliefs. And going back to Ramana Maharishi, what he's doing is telling you to inquire into and undermining the most fundamental belief out of which all beliefs grow, basically, the sense of being a self. But it's really true that what it all comes down to, as far as what keeps us in this dividing thought process that makes us just feel like we're separate from things. Things are separate. There's decisions to be made. There's stress, there's struggle, there's problems to fix. There's a past, there's a future. It all comes down to beliefs ultimately. And what I've noticed is when we're able to intelligently or in a practical way, inquire into a belief until we sort of dissolve that belief or relax that belief, it's like perspective just suddenly increases in a way. It's like we can almost see two directions at once, maybe something like that, about a certain subject or in a certain context. And the more that happens, the more you start to experience this. Clarity is the word I use for it, but it's this exquisite, like knowing that wherever I look, I'm putting it in a relative sense, but like wherever I look, there's just more clarity. Like there's nothing to solve. The clarity just keeps clarifying itself again and again and again. Whereas the mind has almost the opposite feel. Like the more I think, the more I'm in a box. The more I think, the more divided everything seems and feels, and the more struggle seems to happen. And the more I struggle, the more I'm struggling against struggle, and the more struggle I feel. And but reality seems to almost be the opposite way, where it's just like, oh my gosh, it's just opening to itself more and more and clearer and clearer and clearer. That's what it feels like to disentangle identity from belief, until the final belief is that there is identity at all. And that one's a little trickier to get under because there's not much left to do it. There's no identity to oppose it in a sense, but it tends to fall away, I guess, on its own. But so you can inquire into any belief. But I think the most important thing about belief is what I put at the beginning of that chapter. And I also put it in the kind of cautions chapter at the beginning. And that is something I've just noticed about people who have very rigid belief structures, and that they actually feel like they have to defend them. And it can be about anything. Often it's about like religion or politics, but it's about self. It's about a lot of things where it's like, there are certain beliefs I hold that are so sacred. I will never question them. I'm not even going to look closely at them. I just don't want to change them for whatever reason. I don't want to investigate. I find people that do that, they may have very good conditions in this life, so they may not suffer too much, but put in the inevitable situation where they have a trauma, they lose somebody close to them, or whatever, they really don't adjust well, is what I find. Whereas people who are willing to inquire into their beliefs or just look at them as such, like, oh, I actually have this belief that, I don't know, I have to react this way or that way to a certain situation, or I have this belief that my mother did this or whatever. Just being willing to inquire into those and look at them objectively as a belief, and then do a little work around it and see, well, why did I come up with that? What am I taking in reference to actually believe that's true right now? An example of this that I find is very freeing for people who have done a lot of spiritual work around this stuff. And they often will come up to this place where they're like, okay, there's this way I can experience sort of pure consciousness in my mind where I'm not doing any sort of inquiry, but I can also do this like inquiry around this particular thing. Which one should I do? They ask. And I say, first of all, let's look and see, is it actually true that there's someone or something there that has to choose between those, that those are even separate things? And they often can't find any evidence that they're separate things. And the weird thing is there's like an often effect where it just dissolves. And you're like, oh my God, that wasn't even a thing. That was a thought. There's a thought that's like, listen, like the ego loves to put a gun to your head and be like, you need to make a decision right now. It's either this or that. And you're like, okay, which one should I choose? Which one should I choose? Total false dichotomy, right? What if there's nothing to choose at all? And then all of a sudden practice feels different. It's like, oh, I know the relevant thing to look at is right here. And then it just dissolves. And then it's time to meditate. And then I'm meditating, and now I'm walking, and all of a sudden things are starting to feel very intimate and non-dual, and I don't see boundary, So beliefs, like very fundamental beliefs, like I have this important choice to make right now, and that's what's holding me up. And until I make that choice, I can't get down the road to realization or something. Those sorts of sticky beliefs that feel very close and intimate and important are often the ones that you get the most release out of investigating, whether it's even there at all. That choice, or that the belief is that there's a choice right here. that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Um, I found a lot of things you wrote in the book that reminded me and was very applicable to a relational practice I do called circling.
Mm.
I later heard you mention circling during another interview. So it seems like you're familiar and maybe you have experiences with this practice. Besides for being a relational or emotional processing practice, do you think circling can serve to facilitate awakening? Also, assuming you've circled in the past, how has that practice impacted you?
That's a great question. I don't know a lot about it, but I do have a few friends who know a lot, and they hold circling groups and so forth, and they're pretty good at it. Um, I've I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever actually gone to a formal circling group and had it done with me, but the experience I have with it is this. Well, okay, two things that are kind of different. One is, have you ever seen the movie The Work?
I don't think I have.
Dude, you got to see it, man. It's on Amazon Prime. There's two versions, 2017 and 2019, and they're both very similar. I think one has a little extra in it. It's about Folsom Prison in California, and it's a circling group of the inmates. But these guys are they're so dialed in. They're so good at it. They actually invite outside people to come in once or twice a year to do a weekend workshop. And these guys from the outside who aren't criminals come in with these like lifelong criminal, basically, they're never getting out of prison, but they're so good at this and they're so clear. They work them through their own emotional stuff. And it is probably the most powerful thing I've ever seen. I've watched it probably 7 or 8 times. It's amazing.
Is it a documentary or is it a
documentary?
movie?
But
Oh,
they film it. They film them going through it. Yeah, it's so good.
It's awesome, man. I gotta check it
So
out.
that really somewhat turned me on to the power of it, at least done in the right settings and with the right people. Because you watch that and you're like, wow, okay, there's huge value to this. So I have a friend who has done a lot of circling groups. So on my retreats, which I started doing home retreats a few years ago, a couple times a year, and then I recently did one in California. There were more people who were interested than I could put in my house. So we did one of like 30 people. But I've always done semi-silent retreats because I like the silence aspect, and you can get into deep meditation. And I came from a Zen background. But I also like to do relational stuff. So a few hours a day, like during dinner, and then we do like a group interaction thing. I've actually done some stuff with improv. So I do very, very simple improv techniques because improv actually requires you to be present externally, like present with other people and notice what everyone's doing. And you can't go back internal and reflect again, or else you drop the ball in a sense with these improv exercises. So, and people have always enjoyed it. The last few retreats, I've incorporated some circling that my friend Mark has described to me. And he actually came up with it specifically for the retreat. Very simple exercises, but they're really good. Actually, they're quite enjoyable. And I never did the thing where we never put a person in the middle necessarily. What we do is we just go around and describe a physical experience we're having right now, non-judgmentally. It can be like, I feel pressure on my butt on the chair. And then the next person says it, and the next person. But when you've been meditating for days on end, it's so fascinating what happens. Like you feel such an immediate bond with people because we're actually talking about what we're physically feeling, even though there's no story or narrative or emotion around it. It's an actual physical experience. And then we start relating to what we heard and how that's affecting how we're feeling. And then I started just kind of asking questions. Did you guys notice how quickly you felt in rapport with everyone around you doing this versus just talking? And people universally said like, yeah, actually it was surprising. Suddenly I felt like connected to everyone in this room in an emotional way. Whereas if I was talking, I may or may not have, but often when we're just talking, we're interfacing through a bit of a persona or a lot of a persona. So that's what I found. I find it really interesting and powerful, and I'm looking forward to using more of it. So I would say if you find a group that looks like they really know what they're doing and you resonate with it, anyone listening, obviously you do it already, but circling and that kind of thing where someone can reflect authentically back to you in a way that maybe helps you see something that's not completely obvious to yourself, but definitely in a non-violent way. You got to be careful of being around, people who just use that as an excuse to kind of be toxic and stuff. I'm sure some of that goes on too. You don't want that kind of thing, but people who are serious about their own deepening of truth and then can reflect back on you. I think that's wonderful. I would highly recommend anybody do that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating practice. I actually came across it. I was at this modern day monastery called Monastic Academy in Vermont, and they they're huge on circling, and I picked that practice up over there. And now I've been doing it online. There's a platform called Circle Anywhere, and they have several circles every day, and it's very well done. The facilitators are great. Just it's been amazing, because for me it's like an interpersonal meditation. So like I do a lot of meditation myself, but I don't get, and I'm working from home, I'm on the computer. So it's like, it's good to have more social interaction, but in a completely different way, where there's more transparency and there's less persona and like less of this like social bullshit that we're used to. You mentioned a lot of that in your book. Okay, so what is your take on what is your take? You always got the psychedelic shirts. I love it. You always every video you got like these trippy, spacey, intergalactic. I love it. What is your take on psychedelics, and can they contribute or lead to one's awakening based on your, the people you've worked with? Has that been coming up? How does that play a role in awakening?
Yeah, I say what I tell people when they ask, and I do get asked this question on occasion, is, I'm always a little hesitant to recommend anybody use any specific substance or an illicit substance, because I just never know. Some people really do have addiction potential and so forth. Now, of course, I really don't think hallucinogens generally have, or psychedelics have, an addiction potential generally. In fact, I think we're finding they can probably be used to help with other types of addiction. But so I would always sort of put that caution out there. You never know what a mind that is sort of wired for addiction might go, oh yeah, he said I should use psychedelics, so I'm going to go try some meth or something, So, but yeah, specific to, entheogens or mushrooms, whatever. If that's what is required for someone to break through, to get a breakthrough experience, I think it's fine. I really do. And check it out. If you're interested in, or you're inclined in that way, I don't think there's a lot of harm to it. And there could be the benefit of having that opening. But I will say, when it comes to really deepening realization and so forth, you probably would find that the practice of using those consistently would fall away, I would think, and they could potentially have some side effects. I've seen, I know people who've done really lots and lots of like ayahuasca, lots and lots of entheogens, like a lot. And they might say, like a surprising amount, and they might say this, that yeah, at some point there can almost be an ego reinforcement that starts to go on in that community. These are things I've heard, that it can kind of encourage, it's almost like a magical thinking, more than just clear seeing. So probably like anything, in moderation. And I think the biggest utility probably is to really get a first breakthrough. My Zen teacher had an LSD experience in the 1960s, and that's what set him on the path to Zen. For myself, I did try I tried LSD a couple of times when I was young, and had definitely breakthrough experiences. They were so out there that I didn't even have a context for them afterwards at all. But I knew there was something else for sure. Did they lead me to have further insights into really orienting me to wanting to wake up? Maybe they did. I don't know for sure. So I think it's reasonably common actually that happens. So I'm not against them. And if someone's really inclined to do it and you do it safely and all that sort of thing, I would say, yeah, I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, for me, I feel like that's, when you say you're not sure, like I'm pretty sure that that's what made me like get into meditation. That's what made me start, picking up the mastering the core teachings of the Buddha, like that was, especially with the toad. Like I've done other psychedelics, mushrooms, ayahuasca, all profound experiences, but the toad is like, that was the one for me. That was just like a no going back, crazy shift, complete ego dissolution, complete, you mentioned in your book, the crying and laughing at the same time, because you get the joke of like, oh, there's no need to suffer. Why are we all stepping on each other's toes? There's nowhere to go. There's no one to be. Like that extreme, like paradoxical, just the best feeling you could feel is just crying and laughing at the same time. Mm-hmm. But then I did feel that it's like afterwards, like after those significant shifts, there became less of a pull for psychedelics. Mm-hmm. And I think there's still a lot of like opening up the unconscious mind and like healing trauma and stuff, that it's that it could work for, but it's also not a magic pill. Like it's just it's really weird. Like just like for some people, like psychedelics lead to spirituality, but for some people it leads to conspirituality, and for some people they just stay in relative reality. Like
Yeah.
it just
Yeah, overall, I don't have a problem with them. I think it's probably, it's probably good that they're around. Let's say, put it that way.
yeah, they're here for a reason, right? Like
Yeah, probably.
there's an insight you share in the book. I wonder if this is like the ultimate insight, but kind of feels like it. But it's like, once again, it has paradox tied up into it. And you basically say there is no way that things really are. And from my understanding, this is what emptiness is, or the recognition that there is no inherent self.
Mm-hmm.
And like from a more relative viewpoint, this comes up for me when people are like convinced that someone or something is some way, or say things like, you're always like this, or you never, or that's not the real you. Mm-hmm. Basically like really trying to solidify something as if it's inherently like, this is how it is. Mm-hmm. So like, can you just like kind of expand on that? I
Sure.
just think that's great.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure I've said this in other interviews, but to put it simply, the night I had the first part of the awakening, that's what I describe in the book, which was to unbound consciousness, pure sense of I, without any word or thought or concept. It was beautiful, massive dissolution. I remember knowing, and I had never been around spiritual people or anything like that, but I remember knowing, it's like, this is what people really want. This is what, and when people get into spirituality, I knew this is what they wanted. I'm like, this is what they're looking for. Wow. And it wasn't like I have what they're looking for. It's like, oh, we all have it. The way to access it is to stop trying to be something and just, whatever. But I wasn't having to think about this. It was just clear. It was obvious. And then the next morning, when I sat to meditate, I was immediately there again. Of course, it didn't really go anywhere, but it was just immediate, obvious piece of this pure knowingness. And then it went completely beyond that to a whole place. It's not a place, but it went completely beyond that. And then I had a different kind of insight. It didn't feel terrifying for me, but I've heard people describe this part it can be very terrifying for people at first. But for me, it was like home, but there's no home to be home. And that it's all paradox from here. But it was very, very obvious that the self, there's just nothing like a self. There was no sense of self, and there really could never be. But then I had the insight. I'm like, this isn't what people are looking for. People aren't really looking for this. You can't even look for this. You can't want this. It's not wantable. And it's not bad. It's just so far beyond anything in the human dimension. It's just, it's so weird to talk about this. So that's one of those things I'm careful talking about, because I don't want to discourage anyone, because I would never discourage anyone from this, but it is so far beyond anything in the human realm, even the realm of life, even the realm of reality. It's beyond reality. It's like, you can't want this. And I knew that. And the words for that were actually something like, there is no way that things are. And I knew that was a truth that mostly people don't want to hear. And the way I would describe it is like, when you see the basic functioning of mind, of consciousness, of thought, it's like what it's always kind of trying to do. It's taking a picture of what's happening right now. It's like, click, here's what's happening. And then it immediately takes that picture and tries to weave it into a story that has to do with solidity, continuity, separation, doership, agency. Like, I have to have an ability to do something. I have to have a world in which I can do it. I have to feel like I have the power to do anything, right? Because I don't want to feel helpless. Like the mind does this so quickly, but that initial picture taking is going, this is how it is. This is how it is. The mind's trying to always pick up on how things are. But when you're able to, however it happens, through realization process, whatever, back all the way to that very edge, you realize, in one way of saying it, there's nothing happening at all. The picture flashing is the mind. And beyond that, there's nothing you can put your hand on anymore. Nothing you can, as my girlfriend says, there's nowhere you could ever rest your head. There's no resting place. There's no solid place. There's no perspective of any kind. But it doesn't mean there's nothing, because nothing is also a perspective. It's not no-thingness, really. No-thingness more refers to the non-formed experience of reality. Nothingness or no-thingness is actually a sort of negation of what the mind puts together as physical reality. It's a pointer, but that's not what I'm pointing to. What I'm pointing to is you can't even say it's not something. It's not in the realm of something and nothing, or reality and not reality. It's not even an it. And so, yeah, the phrase "there is no way that things are" is kind of a way of saying that, but I can never ever say how this is. Indeterminacy is a pretty good word for it. The unborn. I like the term. The unborn is actually bonky. The Zen master used to say that everything's perfectly managed in the unborn, but there is the term unborn also in the suttas, the original suttas. The unborn is a good word for it, but it's so ineffable, maybe, that I almost hesitate to even point to it directly, because I'd rather just lead people into their own depth of experience to whatever level works for them till they stop feeling suffering. And it may not be this. It doesn't have to be necessarily. Yeah, so it's the ultimate affront to the mind, to the thought process that needs solidity. It needs something to be there. It needs there to be something there so it can do anything with it. And it needs to believe it's in time, that it has continuity, that if something's here now, it's going to be here 1 minute from now or 1 second from now. But that's not true. What's weird about this, what's super paradoxical about this, is the only expression of it is love. The only expression of it is unconditional love. Adyashanti, I really think he's one of the best teachers you'll ever find. I really love Adyashanti. And he says it like this. He says, the whole physical existence, the universe itself could just disappear. And what your true nature is, your true nature wouldn't even notice it. It wouldn't even notice. But with that, with seeing how easily there could be absolutely nothing at all, comes this love of there being anything at all and everything. So when there's no significance to anything because there's no solidity to anything, and yet this non-moment right now is infinitely significant.
That's exactly that's been my experience with Toad, is just like the complete dissolution of everything, and it's just pure nothingness. And then out of that nothingness, this immense love and compassion, just like heart breaking open, just crazy feeling. And it's just exact that what you just said reminded me of that. Yeah, I was gonna, yeah, go ahead.
It's like, there's no relative absolute. There's not none of it. So what is there left to do is to get out of the way so that unconditional love can come back and move through the relative at any level it needs to, at any place it needs to. It doesn't need to tell people they're not awake enough. It's nothing like that. It's just moment to moment, complete vulnerability at the human level. That's all it is. That's all it comes down to. Very simple. And what's right in front of your face is all there is. It's an illusion. It's not really anything, but that's all there is. That's all there ever could be. Seemingly. It's
a crazy joke. So I was going to ask this at the beginning, and it's just, for some reason, it's like alive in me right now. It seems that like people are willing to believe anything, but they have so much disbelief and so much skepticism towards awakening or enlightenment, or this kind of possibility of a different way of being. And yeah, I don't like, to me, the obvious answer seems that it's just because it so radically goes against our wiring and how we, in relative reality, how it works. Like, it's so radically different. That's why people are just I'm just always running into that. Like, people are so doubt. There's so much doubt and skepticism, and and I've learned to let go of that and just like, it's okay. But I'm just wondering, like, in your experience, when you run into like doubt and skepticism, like what is that, and like why is it that people, they will believe anything but this? Like the best thing they don't want to believe, but they'll believe in anything else.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't have an agenda that anyone has to believe anything. I really truly don't. Like in moment to moment life, practical life, I don't have any need to talk about what we're talking about. And the conduit for that, or the way to that, is really just love, just loving what's right in front of my face. But also when it's non-dual, meaning it's really weird, but it's not like there's a person there and there's a person here. It's just these non-dual textures that are so intimate and so beautiful and alive, but in the context of awakening, in the context of realization, for instance, like, okay, some videos that are out there of like my interviews with Zubin, or occasionally a review on my book will say something like this. It's like, this is complete mumbo jumbo. Like, it doesn't even make sense. The words you're saying make no sense, right? Or they'll say like, to say there's no separation is completely stupid. Like, that's the most obvious thing in the world. I'm looking and I see separation, right? Now I don't take offense to that at all. I take zero offense to that. I actually know exactly what that is. I know what that is. It's fear, but the person who's saying it doesn't know it's fear necessarily, because they're not feeling the fear. But what it really is we're so identified with thoughts and concepts that something that cannot be neatly and conveniently shoved into a concept right now for me to eat right now to make myself comfortable with another concept, that's not okay. That, like, it's like a fear of the mystery, right? It's a fear of something that's mysterious, that's unknowable, right? And so it's ultimately, it's just a fear of letting go of the identity that's tied into thoughts and concepts. And that's why this always comes back to a matter of identity. If you know where somebody's identity is, well, they'll tell you, then you know where they are, you know who they are, and you can meet them at wherever they are, and it's perfectly okay. You don't even have to think about it. So yeah, mind identification is a widespread, you could say it's an illness, but it's the human condition for sure. Meaning identity literally is taking itself from concepts. I notice this on planes. Like, I get on a plane now and people always have to have, it used to be reading stuff, like they'd be reading magazines and stuff. Now it's phones. Everyone's on the phones, but it's like, just sit on a plane for an hour and don't do anything and just look around. You'll notice people really can't go more than maybe 30 seconds or a minute without engaging their mind, engaging the intellect, reading something, watching something on a phone, watching a movie. But to just sit in presence or just be there and just look around, it's almost like taboo to do that, right? I do it all the time, but because I'm fascinated by it. But it shows you, like, the ego is a hungry beast. It needs constant reinforcement that it is there, that there is someone that's moving through. And we use constant influx of concepts and thinking to actually, it's like a narcotic. It's like an opioid, right? It keeps us a little bit of just asleep enough to not look at the ghastly truth that we're not here in the way we think we are. not like that, that the seemingly secure world of, I know what I know, and what I know I'm using to keep reinforcing and reassuring myself that I'm never going to die, that I'm never going to grow old, that I'm never going to have an illness, that I'm not vulnerable, right? That's what we're doing with thoughts. So it really, I think it comes down to, it's like sort of a fear. But again, I don't need to dispel that fear for anyone. That's whatever's happening for anyone is fine. But that's what I read when I see those comments and so forth. I really don't take offense. I get it. And I'm sure I was there when I was, certainly before awakening. There was probably times when if I would have heard something, a message said a certain way, I'd be like, it's just the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That doesn't make any sense. Ha ha ha. Not realizing, like, I was terrified of what that was actually pointing to.
Yeah, that
I am not who I think I am.
Yeah, that resonates. I definitely feel that kind of fear. That fear is underlying that. It's just like not. It's like still it's being stuck to conceptual concepts, logic, like rationality. One of my favorite spiritual teachers, Ram Dass, and his book "Be Here Now." I love that book. It was super trippy. Like, it was like a psychedelic trip. That book for me, it was. And he's like, listen, I feel bad for the rational man. Like, you got what? You got a 60-year trip. Like, he's like, eventually you just got to let go of that. Like, there's limits to it. And like, that's been my experience. Like, I just remember driving once and just feeling like I couldn't explain it in any way. It's like, there's limits to rationality. Like, there's just, I can't think myself out of this,
That right there, what you just said, though, that's what I call suffering, the suffering of mind identification. And that's how I felt. I felt like I was in a pressure cooker. It's like, and when I see, which this kind of takes a bizarre turn, but when I see some of these kids, like, they go and shoot up a high school, I look at them and I go, I know where they are. I know what they have a ton of emotional repression they're not addressing, of course, but the world, that mental world they live in, that's just numb, and they're suffering so much and trying to find the answer, and they get so distanced from themselves, from humanity, from other people, that people to them look like cardboard cutouts or something, you know, almost. I get it. Like we live in a sort of ocean of suffering in a way. The collective human consciousness, I think Eckhart Tolle's right, that the pain body thing makes sense, that there's this sort of life force of pain body that lives in human consciousness, and it goes dormant, but it can activate in the right conditions for sure. And what are those conditions? Well, there's families where everybody abuses each other, even sexually abuses each other. There's whole nations who commit genocide, like, you know, and then 20 years before they were just normal people. 20 years later, they're just normal people, but something happened in that period where people can become incredibly violent. So to the degree that we're asleep, to the degree that we're unconscious willingly, we carry around the potential to allow that to activate, to perpetuate violence on ourselves or others. And so once you really pick that up, once I think you've sensed that that's true, especially when this starts to deepen, it's like you kind of feel compelled, like what else are you going to do? You have to really dispel ignorance at every level. And that's, you know, where Buddhism kind of shines. I mean, that's exactly what Buddha said, and he was right on the money.
There's this immense paradox that's coming up for me right now about you. It's funny, you're an anesthesiologist, and then you teach awakening, and it's like you put people to sleep and you numb people out, and then you wake people up and like make them feel more. So I don't know, it's so funny. That just came up to me right now.
It's kind of bizarre.
So I guess you mentioned paradox so many times, and I'm like fascinated with paradox. You write in the book, paradox isn't a side effect of awakening. The truth of the matter is that the natural state of things, let's call it reality, is by its very nature entirely paradoxical. And this resonated for me. And I actually think before I got into meditation, before I got into spirituality, psychedelics, that thought just started coming to me. Like, I don't know if it was intuition or what it was. It would just come. Life is a paradox. Life is a paradox. And I didn't know what it meant, but it just felt like super real. It just felt like it was pulling me somewhere. I'm not sure if there's much more that can be said about paradox, but maybe you have something more to add on it to it.
Well, you know, like I put that chapter was maybe the most fun one to write. It was really fun to write it, you know, because in one way of speaking, it's probably the most accurate chapter in the book, right? The paradox says so much. It says, first of all, that you can't say anything in a way, but it also says paradoxically that you can sure say a lot, and that can point to something that's not pointable to, right? It's just paradox after paradox. But it's experienced here. It's very obvious, like the everything, when you finally see the nothingness, the empty nature of everything, strangely, only then can you experience swallowing saliva fully for the first time in your life and know the depth of that. Know that that's the whole universe doing that. Taking one step, and it's the whole universe taking a step. Now, this is absurd to the normal way of thinking, but keep waking up and you'll know what this means. It's like, holy shit, that's exactly what it is. That's everything as one step. That's a miracle. It's amazing. And it's not a miracle that Angelo performed. It's a miracle of reality doing what reality does for no one. You know, there's paradoxes in no self, like you know, there's the Advaita Vedanta videos where people say there's no self, there's no one to do anything, there's no seeker, there's no one that can, you know, it's a way of teaching, and it can transmit. It can actually be a pretty powerful transmission, but it has its limits because it starts to feel fixated after a while. It starts to feel like a message that's not flexible at all. That's not how reality is. You know, as Adyashanti says, you'll never have no sense of self whatsoever. It doesn't make sense, right? If someone calls your name and you can't even recognize that someone called your name, like, you're going to be absolutely non-functional, right? So that, at least in one sense, that's a sense of self. But the underlying sense of self as an identity structure doesn't exist at all. It's nowhere to be found and never can be. And yet you can function very easily in the practical sense. It's simple. It's not a problem. I don't have to walk around going, oh, there's no Angelo, and what happened here was, and I don't have to talk like that because there's no contradiction between the relative and absolute, between the conventional and, you know, unfiltered reality. It intermixes perfectly. In fact, they have to be one and the same to see clearly. when you see one side, you're not seeing clearly. When you see both sides at the same time, that's clarity. One way of speaking. But then when you see both sides, you can see every side at once, one side, two sides, four sides, doesn't matter, you know? So yeah, in simple terms for somebody who's maybe just starting out or whatever, I would just say, hey, look at the types of stories and movies that we really love. They're the ones that are paradoxical. They have massively surprising endings. And especially the ones that involve a shift in perception of the person of what they thought was going on, you know, Fight Club or The Matrix, or whatever. But things that are paradoxical, you know, even literature, the book, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The first line in the book is completely paradoxical, and yet it conveys something that you didn't have to be alive during the French Revolution to understand about your life, right? Paradox conveys so much in art and so forth. And there's a reason for that. And that is that reality itself is paradoxical, which is so wonderful.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in a psychedelic trip right now. I feel like hanging out with you could get real trippy real quick.
Yeah, it's fun.
For sure. So what's next for you? What are you doing? Is there another book?
Oh, okay. I was like, oh God, I can't answer that question. Sorry, let me
yeah, no worries. No worries.
Yeah. I've had many requests to do an audiobook of the one I already wrote, so I'll probably try to record that in the near future. And I will definitely write the second book. I don't know what the time frame, within the next year or two. Making video, like a lot of YouTube videos right now, which I'm really enjoying.
See, you got the studio set up. That's what you're doing.
Studio set up, yeah.
The videos are awesome.
Yeah, it's fun. So I've got all that going on. But the funny thing is, really moment to moment, I don't even know what I'm going to do next. It's so funny. That probably those things will come up. I'm pretty sure over the next year to 2 years, and that's about it.
More retreats? You're planning?
Oh yeah, retreats. Yeah. So we are doing bigger retreats now. I do a retreat at my house a couple times a year, but I can only host 10, 11 people or something at the most in my Zendo, and people come from in town too. But yeah, more people were asking for retreats than I could host. So I'm just looking for places to host them. And it's tricky now with the pandemic and stuff to do in-person retreats, but I do have online retreats that I'm doing. I'm doing one starting tomorrow, actually, for 4 days. I didn't post it like publicly. I only posted it to a few lists because I'm using Zoom to do it. And there's a limit to 100 people. I don't think I'm going to have 100 people this retreat, but if I do my wide list, it might be too many people, and then I don't want people not to be able to get in. So at some point I'll find a way to make that maybe bigger if we need to. But then I'll be able to post my online retreats, like, so people can just join in. Yeah.
Yeah, Angelo, it's just been a pleasure to be here with you. Just reading your work, doing the meditations. I've been using your meditation app, and I just love the meditations on there, and watching your videos on YouTube. And yeah, somebody, like I said, somebody recommended you on Daniel Engler. 2 people actually recommended me, and one person recommended it. I went and I researched you, and then I was like, all right, I'll come back to him, because they were like, oh, you got to have him on the podcast. And then somebody else mentioned you again, and I was like, all right, now there's 2 people mentioned, let me go, and I really started to dive into your stuff. And yeah, it's just been fascinating. And like the way I experienced you, like super transparent, like just like very like a mirror, just nowhere to get stuck, like and the teaching, once again, it's just like it's like it needs a category in its own, because it's just so clean. There's just no, it's like, it's the pointing is I just told somebody yesterday, I was like, I think that your book might be like the last book somebody may need for like awakening. Like, it's like you read that book and like anything else is just, more intellectualizing spirituality, but like this is it. Like, this is just simple, just simple pointing to what is. Yeah, and so I just want to thank you for elevating you, quote unquote, for elevating consciousness, for helping us discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. And thanks a lot for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was great talking to you.
For sure. I hope to speak soon, and I hope we stay in touch.
For sure. Take care, man.